Welcome back. All right, so I've taken the Wayback Machine again today, looked at the standings on this date each year. The one exception being the 2020-2021 season, which was entirely in 2021, entirely in a division. And I debated about whether or not to have the 2019-2020 season on there because, of course, there was the pause. Not everybody played the same amount of games. But I thought, no, we could take a look at this for today's video. Looking at teams below 500 on November 19th and asking a simple question. Are the playoffs out of the question? And the reality is that I'm wearing Calgary because the Flames kind of have the NHL where they wanted them. They've been below 500 twice in the time that I've got on the board here, and both times made the playoffs. So Calgary is the NHL right where they want them. So there you go, Flames fans. Anyways, right now below 500, you've got Montreal at 444. They're 3 points back of the playoffs. Buffalo 441. They're 4 points back of the playoffs. And Columbus 333 and 7 points back of the playoffs. On the western side of things, Seattle a 474 points percentage. They are technically tied for that second wildcard spot, but they have played 2 more games than Anaheim have. The Calgary Flames 441 is their points percentage. They are 3 points back of the playoffs. Minnesota, coming out of their overtime loss today, 412 is their points percentage. They're 4 points back of the playoffs. Nashville, 375 points percentage, 6 points back of the playoffs. The Oilers, a surprisingly low 344 start, 7 points back of the playoffs. Chicago, 8 points back of the playoffs with a 333 points percentage. And San Jose, of course, at the bottom of the league, 208 is their points percentage. They're 11 points back of the playoffs. Now, last year, 9 teams were below 500 on this date. None of them made the playoffs. Some of them got close, but this is where that slow start can really hurt you. So, for the Capitals, they had a 425 points percentage. They ended up with a 488. They had 80 points. They sold at the deadline. They ended up 12 points back at the back of the playoffs. So again, if they'd had a better start, maybe they don't sell at the deadline. Maybe they make the playoffs. Buffalo, one of the ultimate examples of how a slow start dooms a team. 389 was the points percentage a year ago today, so they're better than that. 91 points at the end of the season for a 555 points percentage, and they finished 1 point back of the playoffs. And that's part of the reason I was picking them to make the playoffs this year. I was like, well, they should get in. Nope, hasn't turned out that way. For Ottawa, 382 is their points percentage a year ago today. They ended up with 86 points, a 524 points percentage, and 6 points back of the playoffs. So again, November hurts the Ottawa Senators. Stop me if you heard this before, if you're a Sens fan. For Columbus, 382 is their points percentage. Again, it's slightly worse this year. They ended up with 59 points, which was a 360 points percentage last season, and 33 points out of a playoff spot. So Columbus, not territory they're unfamiliar with. This is the second season in a row where they've been below 500. None of the previous seasons, again, outside of 2020, 2021, which was a very different beast. Columbus, this is kind of a rough year. Out west, Chicago, 441 points percentage, which is better than last year. They ended up with, or it's better than this year, actually, by about 100 points. That kind of throws me off. They ended up with 59 points. They ended up with 360 was their points percentage by the end of the season. 36 points back of a playoff spot. Vancouver, 417 was their points percentage a year ago today. They ended up with 83 points, 506 points percentage. And of course, at this point last year, all the speculation with Boudreau was starting up, and is Bruce sticking around and all that. And of course, we wouldn't get a resolution to that for a while. They ended up 12 points back of a playoff spot, which some fans were happy to see them winning games down the stretch that didn't really mean very much. Others were frustrated because they were hurting their lottery chances. Arizona, 406 was their points percentage a year ago today. They ended up with 70 points, 427 points percentage, 25 points back of a playoff spot. San Jose was 375 a year ago. They'd love that right now. 60 points is where they ended up, a 366 points percentage, and 35 points back of the playoffs. Anaheim, really tough start. They ended up with a 306 points percentage by this date a year ago. They ended up with 58 points, which is a 354 points percentage, 37 points back of the playoffs. So again, the teams that have really, really rough starts, generally their numbers do get a little better during the season. So if you're a Sharks fan thinking, is it going to get better? It probably gets somewhat better. Then we go the previous year, November 19th, 2021. 9 teams below 500, 1 ended up making the playoffs. So over the last 2 years, out of 18 teams below 500 on this date, 1 made the playoffs. Not Detroit. They had a 474 points percentage on November 19th of 2021. They ended up with 74 points, a 451 points percentage, and 26 points back at the playoffs. The Islanders, they had a 462 points percentage. They ended up with a 512, 84 points. They were the only one in the East that maybe kind of flirted with being in contention for a playoff spot, but they ended up 16 points out by the time it was all said and done. Ottawa started with a 300 points percentage on this day 2 years ago. They ended up with 73 points, a 445 points percentage, and 27 points back at the playoffs. Montreal, it was a nightmare start for Montreal. 263 points percentage right after going to the Stanley Cup final. 55 points at the end of the year, a 335 points percentage, 45 points out of a playoff spot. Then you go out west, you got Dallas, 467 points percentage, and here it is, the team that made the playoffs. They ended up with 98 points, a 598 points percentage, and again, they made the playoffs. They were out in the first round, but they did make it. Vancouver, 389 points percentage, so that's back-to-back years Vancouver's on the board. They're on the board 3 times out of the 6 seasons I've tracked outside of this one, and in none of those seasons did they make the playoffs. So for Vancouver, it's been kind of a rough go. If they start below 500, that's generally where they end up. The interesting thing is they ended up with 92 points, a 561 points percentage. Why? Because they fired Travis Green and hired Bruce Boudreau. They ended up 5 points back of a playoff spot. Bruce, there it was so close. For Chicago, 375 points percentage. They ended up with 68 by the end of the season, a 415 points percentage, and 29 points back of a playoff spot. Seattle, 265 start to that first season, so they're much better than they were the first season right now. They end up with 60 points, a 366 points percentage, which again is below where they are right now, and 37 points back of a playoff spot. For Arizona, 176, which is the lowest number on the board by a pretty good margin if you look at the 208 and say, well, that's better. But yeah, they ended up with 57 points, a 348 points percentage. They ended up 40 points back of a playoff spot. So that's your 2021 and 2022 look. Now we get to 2019-2020, and there's an asterisk to this, right? So there's 8 teams below 500 on this date 4 years ago. 3 of them end up making the playoffs. Toronto was above the playoff line. However, they lost in the play-in round. Calgary, they made it through the play-in round and lost in the first round. And then there's Minnesota, who lost in the play-in round. So technically, did 1 team make the playoffs or 3? And it really depends on which source you use. So I'm saying 3 because it feels like that's the official look at it. But yeah, Toronto had a 478 points percentage 4 years ago today. They ended up with 81 points, which was a 579 points percentage. And again, made the playoffs, but lost in that qualifying round. Ottawa had a 452 points percentage, so they're on the board 3 years in a row. They're not there right now. 62 points by the end of the year, a 437 points percentage, and 9 points back of a playoff spot. For New Jersey, a 450 points percentage on this date 4 years ago. They ended up with 68 points, which was a 493 points percentage, 3 points back of the Montreal Canadiens, who made it in because of the expanded playoffs, right? Detroit, 370 points percentage, and it dropped. By the end of the year, they were at 39 points, 275 points percentage. That pause couldn't come fast enough for them. They were 32 points back at the playoffs. Then we go out west. You've got the Calgary Flames, who had a 479 points percentage 4 years ago today. They end up with 79 points, a 564 points percentage. And again, they won the qualifying round, and then they lost in the first round that year. San Jose, a 477 points percentage, 63 points by the end of the season, 450 points percentage by the end of the year, and 9 points back of a playoff spot. Minnesota had a 429 points percentage, so actually a little better than what they have right now. They ended up with 77 points, a 558 points percentage, and lost qualifying round against the Vancouver Canucks. The LA Kings, a 405 points percentage 4 years ago today. They ended up with 64 points, which was 457 for a points percentage, and 8 points back at the playoffs. And again, the bar to make the playoffs dropped a lot when you looked at the 2019-2020 expanded playoffs. Then we go back to 2018, and this is part of the reason I wanted to do this, because everybody mentions St. Louis. Every time. There's fans right now of almost every team here that are going to say, Well, yeah, but look what St. Louis did. And my answer was always things were rough with St. Louis. They weren't as bad, I think, as people remember them. And once Binnington came in, things got a lot better. So on this date, 5 years ago, New Jersey had a 474 points percentage. By the end of the year, they had 72 points, which was a 439 points percentage, 26 points back of a playoff spot. The Pittsburgh Penguins had a 474 as well. They made the playoffs. They had 100 points. 610 points percentage by the end of the year. So Pittsburgh, really strong run there. Vancouver, a 478 points percentage on this day 5 years ago. They ended up with 81 points, a 494 points percentage, 9 points back of a playoff spot. So within 10 points, within 5 points. Sure, Canucks are close, right? Right now they're in the playoffs, so that's important. Anyways, Anaheim, 477 points percentage on this day 5 years ago. They ended up with 80 points, a 488 points percentage, 10 points back of a playoff spot. The Oilers, 475 was their points percentage. By the end of the year, they had 79 points. What's interesting is these teams all stayed really, really close, apparently, from this date through the end of the year. The Oilers, 11 points out of the playoffs. So 1 point back, 1 point back. And from a points percentage standpoint, very, very similar numbers. And then there's St. Louis, 447 points percentage. By the end of the year, they had 99 points, 604 points percentage, and most importantly, they were one of the hottest teams in the second half of the season. And that is, generally speaking, a way to tell who's a contender going into the playoffs. Look at the record over the second half. The team with a really strong record in the second half will usually be really tough to knock out in the first round. Vegas, 432 points percentage. They ended up making the playoffs too. They had 93 points by the end of the year, 567 points percentage. They lost in the first round that year, famously or infamously, however you want to look at it. The LA Kings, 375 points percentage. Yeah, my voice cracked. I think I'm hitting puberty. 375 points percentage for LA. 71 points by the end of the year, a 433 points percentage, and 22 points back of a playoff spot. Now, 500, there are years where there's very few that actually have a below 500 record. And on November 19th of 2017, there were 5 teams below 500. None of them ended up making the playoffs. Starting with Montreal, who had a 429 points percentage. 71 points by the end of the year, a 433 points percentage, 26 points back of the playoffs. Florida, 400 points percentage, but by the end of the year, they were only 1 point out of the playoffs. They ended up with 96 points. A 585 points percentage. So again, that slow start hurts Florida later. Those points they don't have in October and early November hurt them later in the year. Buffalo started with a 350 points percentage that year. They ended up with a 378 points percentage with 62 points, 35 points back of the playoffs. And Buffalo shows up on this board entirely too often. Out west, the Oilers, a 400 points percentage. So there's the Oilers for the third time on the board. They ended up with 78 points, a 476 points percentage, 17 points back of a playoff spot. And there's Arizona again, 250 points percentage on this date 6 years ago. They ended up with 70 points, a 427 points percentage, 25 points out of the playoffs. And then the last year I wanted to look at, November 19th of 2016, the 16-17 season, the first season where this channel was kind of a growing item here. And this just shows how long the channel's been a growing concern, and it's insane to me. Anyways, 7 teams were below 500. One of them actually made the playoffs, the team that I'm wearing. So the Detroit Red Wings, 472 points percentage on this day 7 years ago. They ended up with 79 points, a 482 points percentage, 16 points back of the playoffs. So this is where the pain starts for Detroit, right? It's not my fault, though, I promise. So Buffalo, they're like, that's it. That's what it is. Since this channel came in, Detroit hasn't made the playoffs. Vanquish. So Buffalo's on the board again, 444 points percentage. They ended up with 78 points at the end of the year, 476 points percentage. They ended up 17 points back at the playoffs. This is why I will not complain about Buffalo fans not going to games, because the points percentage 7 years ago and right now look very, very remarkably the same. Very, very similar. In fact, they're 3 points worse right now than they were 7 years ago. So, definition of insanity. But yeah, 17 points back at the playoffs. And then the Islanders had a 412 points percentage on this day 7 years ago. They ended up with 94 points. They missed the playoffs by 1 point. 573 points percentage. So again, that slow start to the season Submarines, their chances to make the playoffs by the end of it. Then out west, you've got the Colorado Avalanche, who had a .471 points percentage, which is not great, not awful. It was awful by the end of the year. They ended up with 48 points, a .293 points percentage, 46 points out of the playoffs. On the Vancouver front, .421 was their points percentage. Vancouver's on here way too often. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 times. So 69 points by the end of the year, a .421 points percentage. So they were consistent. They were consistent. 25 points back at the playoffs. So playoffs? What are playoffs? I'll just be happy to win another game. The Coyotes are on the board again. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 times the Coyotes are on here. .412 points percentage. By the end of the year, they had 70 points for a .427 points percentage, 24 points back at the playoffs. And then finally, after a coughing fit, the Calgary Flames, .395 points percentage on this date 7 years ago. They made the playoffs. 94 points, .573 points percentage, and they're the only team to make the playoffs twice. Calgary twice, Vegas, Pittsburgh, Dallas, St. Louis, Minnesota, and Toronto. Now, that's 8 out of 46 teams that have been below 500 on this date over the last 7 years who have made the playoffs. So now it's going to be 56 teams by the end of this year. How many of them make it? Now, looking at the average, I would say 2 or 3 should. I would say since there's so many in the West that are below 500, it is quite possible, if not probable, at least one of them ends up in the playoffs. In the East, it's more of a challenge. You've got Montreal, Buffalo, and Columbus. I don't know. I mean, Buffalo should be better than what they are, I think. And Montreal's been plucky, sure, but eventually that kind of falls by the wayside. And of course, one team out of 46 won the Stanley Cup when it was below 500. That is St. Louis. It gets used a lot. It gets mentioned a lot. I'm sure that for teams over here that are in this situation, they're like, hey, remember St. Louis when they were the worst team in the league? And that's where I put my hand up and say, I don't think they were ever at the bottom of my power rankings. And every week I kept saying, they're starting to play better. They're just not getting the results. And then eventually those results came. And things got a lot better. So teams are definitely already in danger if they're below 500 at this stage of the season. And I think for a team below 400, unless it's Calgary, and Calgary's not below 400, below 400 seems like that's the number that, yeah, you're not going to make it. I'm just looking over the board now, so nobody made it there. That was a 467 team, 479, 429, 478, 474, 447, 432, and 395. So only Calgary. So Calgary seems to have some sort of an immunity that other teams don't when it comes to slow starts. But let me know your thoughts. Can Calgary do it again? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, because if you do, it'll hurt my feelings. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I'll probably rapidly cycle through these cold symptoms, and it'll probably be gone by tomorrow. That's generally how my system works. I rapidly go through the symptoms, and then I'm better within a day or two. But thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.